Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace and blessings be upon everybody, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Rabbi, nafa'ni fi ilmi wa 'allimni ma yanfa'ni. Oh Allah, grant me beneficial knowledge and give me benefit from the knowledge that I already have, inshallah. I think based on what we talked about last week, we were going to talk about the lesser known companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family. We went into the intro about that. We talked about some of the a better drawn map this time than last week. And then I want to talk about last week's map where I made an error in terms of the rivers. This is the Euphrates and this is the Tigris, or the Furat and the Dijla in Iraq. I think I mixed them up last week. And then we have a better drawn map, courtesy of brothers Andrew and brother Jibril, alhamdulillah. And then we have the timeline as well, inshallah. This we will use as a reference, inshallah, for every one of the Sahaba, so we can understand where they are in terms of history. Sometimes we forget that things are occurring all at the same time, and sometimes we forget the geography, how things looked back then, inshallah. And then back to the point of all of this is to understand what the personalities that we know as the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, and the Imams alayhi salam, were going through around them, as well as what their companions are going through. Because sometimes we only find that we think of them in isolation, and there's a whole world out there that was going on versus just them in isolation. And then number two is to also, think about it from a real world perspective, as in how do people act today? And it's similar to how people acted before as well, right? How people change from what we think is good to what we think is bad to back to what we think is good, right? The taqallib of the qulub, that the hearts kind of switch around, and it's similar. That's how history is. That's how people are. It's nuanced, and it's not always truly black and white in terms of the people around the Prophet, peace be upon his family, as well as the Imams alayhi salam. So we'll start inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim with Uthman ibn Haneef. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Uthman ibn Haneef radiyallahu anh, was originally from the Yathrib or Medina. So if you guys remember, Mecca is over here. Mecca. And the north of that is Medina, or traditionally called Yathrib in Arabic. Before it was called Medina. Medina means just city, or Medina Munawwar, the light city, was the second name to it after the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, migrated there. But Yathrib was the original name. So he was from Yathrib. And in Yathrib, we know there's two tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, that actually used to live there. And Uthman ibn Hanif was from the Aus. And he is from Bani Hansh ibn Auf, and he's from the Aus family tree originally. So he's actually from the Ansar. He was not from the Meccans. He was not from the the original people that believed when the revelation came in 13 before the migration. It was after the migration, or the Hijrah, that he actually had his Islam, and that's when he actually became Muslim, because he was part of the Ansar from the Aus family. He according to history and the sources that I'm using, this is not a deep look into these, but this is more of a overview of these people's lives, and I used both Shia and Sunni sources for this because I want to see all the nuances that are out there, and inshallah, as we go through more Sahaba, we might even see conflicting sources, and that's okay. It's good to actually know what the differences are in the narratives of history. So, according to sources, he fought, once he joined the Prophet, peace be upon his family, he fought in all the wars or the battles that were fought with the Prophet, peace be upon his family, or at least he fought in all of them after Badr. Some say he did not see the first battle of Badr. Some, there are sources that say he did see the first battle. But in any case, he fought in pretty much all the battles afterwards, after Badr or including Badr. He was known as a famous narrator of hadith, or the narrations of the Prophet. He is in at least 4 of the big books of the Sunnah. He's in Bukhari, he's in Ibn Majah. He's in Nasa'i. And then one hadith that actually was very interestingly, he may be the lone narrator of that hadith, or one of two, if not three. But he may be the lone narrator of this hadith, the hadith of the blind man. Anyone familiar with the hadith of the blind man? You know what that hadith is? Are you familiar, Doctor? You may know it.
You're
Jeffrey?
talking about like the Surah Abba's?
No, actually. But I think once you hear the story, you'll probably know. Yes, sir.
Is it the one used to prove tawassul?
Yes,
Oh,
or at least
okay.
to talk about a wasila, or how to pray using the Prophet, peace be upon his family. So basically, the story is there was a blind man, and Uthman bin Haneef narrates this hadith that a blind man came to the Prophet, peace be upon his family, and he asked him to heal his eyes. His eyes are getting weak. I can't see. So he told the Prophet, peace be upon his family, please, heal my eyes. And the Prophet um, told him, it's better if you do sabr. It's better if you actually are patient with this affliction. You may get more rewards, and there's a reason for this affliction. So the blind man went away, and then he came back, and then he asked the Prophet, peace be upon his family, no, can you please, heal my eyes? And he told him, it's better to be patient, but if you want to be healed, I can tell you something that will heal you. He's like, no, I want to be healed. I don't want this affliction. So the Prophet, peace be upon his family, told the blind man to pray 2 rak'ahs, to do a prayer of 2 rak'ahs, and then to say the dua in a way where he says, "Oh Allah, I ask you by your Prophet, the Prophet of Mercy, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to heal my blindness." And it was narrated that his blindness was healed. So this is used, to prove tawassul, but you know, what is wasila? We can go deep into what wasila is and what tawassul is, but in any case, it is evidence of the use of the Prophet's name or the Prophet's character to ask for things from God, as an honor to the Prophet, or as a closeness to God, inshallah. So that's one thing he's actually very famous for, and this hadith is in Tirmidhi. Um, in terms of history, so when the Prophet, peace be upon him and his family, was martyred in 11 AH, when um, the conflicts about rulership were occurring after that, he did not give allegiance to Abu Bakr. He actually was one of the ones that actually held back in terms of giving allegiance to the first caliph that came over, and he apparently did not give allegiance at all, or he did not give until Imam Ali alayhi salam gave, if depending on what narrative you look at. There's some narratives that don't even believe in Imam Ali alayhi salam gave allegiance. There's some narratives that do believe that Imam Ali alayhi salam gave allegiance, but it was later, at least 6 months later. So he did give allegiance, but later on, when Imam Ali alayhi salam gave allegiance. Um, things again that he was involved in. He was involved in some of the conquests to Iraq, which is the area over here where the two rivers are. He was one of the generals in that, and it was against the Sassanids in Iraq, the old Persian Empire. That's who was controlling it. And then he also was reported to have a high acumen for business and for in terms of surveying. He used to be a surveyor of the land. He used to be both a tax collector and a surveyor of the land. He used to be one of the most proficient in that. He was actually used by the caliphs to, especially in Iraq, to survey the land, figure out what the value of the land is, and to collect taxes in a just manner from them. So that's actually one of his jobs under the caliphs, at least two of them, if not all of them. He was also one of the ministers in Kufa. So Kufa is over here. Kufa. He was one of the ministers of Kufa. And Kufa started out again as more a barracks than an actual city, and then eventually became a city. And then surveying in Arabic is called mesh. Mesh al-ard. Mesh means to rub it, or to to wipe, but in the more business sense, mesh means to actually survey the land and figure out the taxes of the land. Eventually, he replaced the governor of Basra, which is close to Kuwait. It's the southeast of Baghdad, or southeast of Iraq. He replaced the governor of Basra when Imam Ali alayhi salam um, became caliph. And the governor of Basra was Abdullah ibn Amir, who was a cousin of Uthman, if anyone kind of knows their history. And another thing about his life was when he was the governor of Basra. Anyone know what the big events that happened in Basra are and under the Imam Ali Islam's caliphate? Remember that? It's a big thing, right? Yeah, yeah. Oh, yes, Jamal. So yes, so one of them, our brothers mentioned camel or Jamal, and yes, so when Imam Ali Salam became caliph, and we can go deeper into the whole nuances of the the battle of the camel and stuff. But what eventually happened was the armies of Zubair, Talha, and Aisha went up and towards Basra to set up camp there. And what they did was actually they unfortunately the armies killed several people that were loyalists to Imam Ali alayhi salam, or at least were against um, the, the, the armies of Talha, Zubair, and Aisha. And when they came to Basra, which is where the Abdullah bin Amr, Uthman's cousin, was, because Abdullah bin Amr told them that you can come to Basra, I can help you kind of take over this area, since he had influence there, because he was the former governor there. So he told them to come over to Basra. They had support there. They went over there. They killed several people on the way. They besieged the place. Uthman bin Hanif did not want to give up, because he was the governor. And unfortunately, they captured him. He was tortured, um, by the army. And one of the things that was actually very distinctive about him was that he actually had his beard plucked out, and his eyebrows plucked out, and his eyelashes plucked out as part of the torture. And they actually kind of disgraced him in front of the people. Muthila bih is what the Arabic was, at least per the historical books. So and per history, Zubair and Talha told him that they would have killed him if it was not for the promises they made to people back in Medina and Mecca, because Zubair and Talha had family in Medina and Mecca, and Uthman bin Hanif has family over there as well. So if they had killed Uthman bin Hanif, then people would have taken revenge against their own families over there. So they were like, we would have killed you if it wasn't for you having some covenants with people in our home cities, unfortunately. And then so eventually, when the Battle of Jamal occurred, and the result was Imam Ali alayhi salam had victory. Unfortunately, a lot of Muslims died on that day. Um, Uthman bin Hayf told Imam Ali alayhi salam, "Oh Amir al-Mu'mineen, I left you with a beard, and now I come to you beardless." He was kind of embarrassed about that, and Imam Ali alayhi salam told him, "You will have your rewards for all the suffering that had happened to you, so don't worry about it." One other thing that's actually distinctive about him as well is in the Nahj al-Balagha, the Peak of Eloquence, the book with the sayings and letters of Imam Ali alayhi salam. There is a sermon, sermon number 45, where Uthman bin Hanif apparently attended a rich people's gathering. And unfortunately, in this rich people's gathering, um, the poor people were not invited, or at least their doors were closed to them, or they were not intentionally invited, or they were intentionally barred from this gathering. So Imam Ali alayhi salam heard about this all the way from Medina, or all the way from Kufa, depending on where he was, and he sent him a letter admonishing him for this. And in the beginning of the letter, he admonishes him for such an action, telling him what are your thoughts in terms of allowing yourself to be in this position. And then he goes into a big tirade about the dunya, or life, the limited, finite life. And he tells him that there's nothing of worth, of true worth, of true reality in this finite life, and one should look kind of into the more eternal life, or the more eternal life with God. Um, and in that letter, If you guys, some people are maybe familiar with the saying that Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says that he's happy with 2 loaves of bread and 2 pieces of cloth to cover himself with. And that's actually where that saying comes from, where Imam Ali alayhi salam tried to live his life very, very simply because of the times where there were poor people that were living in a similar situation. He says, I'm happy with my 2 loaves of bread, my 2 pieces of cloth. And he tells Uthman bin Hanif, you should also be happy with your loaves of bread and don't look too much into the worldly affairs which will affect your heart. And then in terms of his death, he died in 57, which is around here, after Hijrah. I did not find a reason for his death or a cause for his death. So I'm not sure if he was martyred, if he was not martyred, how he passed away. And there was not really a lot of mention, what happened, after Imam Ali alayhi salam was martyred. What was his situation with Imam Hassan alayhi salam. What was his situation with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Maybe I didn't look deep enough, but if people do have other thoughts about that or have other information about Uthman bin Hanif, after Imam Ali alayhi salam, it would be nice to know. But that is the brief overview of Uthman bin Hanif, one of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family, as well as Imam Ali alayhi salam. Any questions or something to discuss? Inshallah. All right. Alhamdulillah. To invite Dr. Jafar to discuss the next topic. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Awesome.
Sorry, do you need this?
That's okay. Sure. Just keep it. Actually, maybe I'll just.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Do we have? Can I switch this around too?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. All right. Okay. Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Try not to write too much into your video because it's off camera.
Oh, is this off camera?
Yeah, like a little bit to the right, but if you're left.
Should I try to move it in?
You can, but I'm not sure how much you can.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, guys. So inshallah, we'll try to keep it because I know we're running a little late. So we'll try to keep it focused. I want to just recap some of the main things we discussed last week. Inshallah, Brother Andrew is joining in today. So inshallah, we'll try to also kind of keep it in a way that it summarizes the previous discussion. And then also we can continue to build, inshallah. So um, we were talking about the argument from contingency. So this is in Arabic, it's called Burhan al-Imkan, right? So Burhan al-Imkan, this is one of the proofs of the existence of God. And while we're going through this topic, I should mention the source of where we're getting this information from. So there's a book called Theological Instructions that's written by one of the leading scholars in Iran, who's actually a philosopher, and he actually has written this book as sort of a theological primer for what is it, how should a Muslim understand his beliefs, and um, one of the key things about Islam as a religion is that our beliefs are based on rationality. So we don't believe that you just accept it, like you have to intellectually be convinced. And intellectual conviction is founded upon rationality. So your beliefs need to make sense. They need to be rational. So that's a key premise of our belief as Muslims. So you'll see this uh, trend in the writings of our scholars, and amongst one of our scholars is this individual who's written this book, and it's been translated into English. It's available on alislam.org, and it's a very good book that summarizes how does a Muslim think about his beliefs. It's about 60 chapters, but each chapter is only about like 2 pages. So, if you understand, and each chapter builds on the previous one, so it sort of takes you step by step in terms of how do you build your belief structure. And beliefs are so important as Muslims, right? As well as any religious adherence, your beliefs make your religion, right? So understanding your beliefs and why you believe what you believe is so fundamental to your identity as a religious adherent, right? So, anyways, one of the first things, I mean, we're on chapter 10, I believe, right now, but we've worked through a lot of information. But to kind of really get us to this point, he talks mainly in the beginning about how do you define religion, what is religion, what is the need for religion, why do human beings study religion, right? So he talks about all those factors. But this is kind of the crux of, and we've spent a lot of time on this topic, this Burhan al-Imkan, this argument from contingency, because he presents this argument as one of the most uh, basically airtight proofs for the existence of God that you can imagine, right? Now, there's a lot of arguments that people have. They make arguments, for instance, from design. They say, oh, well, God, look at the structure of the universe. It's so well designed, therefore there must be a designer, right? But obviously, people who are more critical minded, right, skeptics, they'll say, well, what is design, right? How do you define design? We think the world is designed in a very poor way. We think, for instance, the eyeball is designed in a very poor way. Why are the photoreceptors at the back? Why are they not at the front, right? So all sorts of things they'll bring up, right? So the argument from design, for that reason, uh, it has sort of some issues that, of course, it's a strong argument, but you need to explain a lot and kind of go through a lot of rebuttals to get your point across. So he presents this argument of the argument from contingency. And can someone summarize kind of the crux of the argument? Maybe Brother Jabril or Ali Qarar or Muhammad or Abdullah, whatever, whichever one of you guys, inshallah, remembers.
I'm remembering, wasn't contingency about like you just exist sort of in a way?
Not quite. Uh, or maybe, okay, maybe you're getting to it, but I want you to expand on that a little bit. So, what does Burhan al Imkan say in just? Do you remember, Brother Ali Qarar?
Um,
Not really. Okay. All right, Brother Abdullah, do you remember?
So things are either dependent or independent, or at least
Okay.
oh,
contingent, meaning that they're dependent on situations, or they're not dependent on situations.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, things that are dependent on situations, they have to wait for something for a situation to occur, so
Right.
they can actually exist.
Right.
So for things to exist, something must have been always independent of any situation.
Okay. Yeah, I like it. I like it.
That's they
Brother
gave
Muhammad.
an example about racing, like people
Yeah.
racing that if one guy is saying that he's gonna when the other guy runs, but as soon as the other guy starts running, he's gonna run, and then the other guy is saying the same thing, and so they're depending on like each other. But then like if everybody thinks like that, then the race is not even gonna start.
Right.
So there needs to be I believe they called it like an unmoved mover.
Yeah.
With
Or a first mover, right?
first
Okay.
mover.
So yeah, so that's the crux of the. You guys kind of got it. So let me just clarify it a little bit more, right? So the whole argument is based on this notion of contingency. What does contingency mean? It means that basically, in order for something to materialize, it needs the right situation, it needs the right circumstances to make it come to pass, right? So if those circumstances are not actualized, that thing will not be, right? So when we look at, so what this argument says is that, look, everything in the universe falls into one of, everything you can actually even imagine falls into one of these three categories. Either it's impossible, meaning like for instance a square circle, it can't be, right? Right? 2 + 2 = 5. That can't be, right? So those are impossibilities, right? So any notion you can think of falls into one of these three categories. And in this case, those things are impossible, right? Now, the other category is contingent existences, right? So meaning things that exist but require the right circumstances to make them come to pass, right? And basically, you can posit that everything in our universe is like this, right? Everything in our universe needs other things to exist in order for it to come to be, right? For instance, take this tripod, for instance, right? What is it made of? It's made of metal, right? It had a manufacturer. The manufacturer had to put all the parts together, right? In order for this tripod to come in front of us, materialized in front of us, a whole host of factors needed to come together, right? So everything possibly that you can imagine in this universe follows the same principle. Even energy, for instance, matter, right? For matter to exist, it needs time and space, right? So everything in our universe requires certain circumstances to make it come to be, right? Now the argument is, okay, well, if that's the case, why can't everything just be contingent? Everything is just dependent, right? Everything depends on other circumstances to make it come to pass. So that's where Brother Muhammad's argument comes in, right? That if every single thing in this universe required circumstances to make it come to be, nothing would ever come to be, right? So it's like a whole bunch of racers lining up on a start line for a race, and they're all every racer says, "Hey, I'm not going to start until the next person starts," and the other person says, "Oh, I'm not going to start until he starts." Nobody's ever going to start, right? There has to be an initiator who doesn't care about whether anybody else starts or not, right? There has to be a first mover, right? As Brother Muhammad was saying. So we call that the necessary existent, right? That something which exists or comes to be without requiring any circumstances. It's immaterial of any type of, it has no contingencies, right? It just comes to be and it is and it always has been, right? It's that type of existence, right? That doesn't have any type of link to circumstance, right? So that is the crux of the argument. So the postulation is that we cannot just have contingent existences in this universe. We need to have what we call a necessary existence, meaning that it is and it always will be, right? So that's the crux of this argument, the argument from contingency. Now, this is basically the very first building block of the argument for proving God's existence, right? Because we say that God is a being who always was, always will be. He has no type of limitations. He is independent of anything else, of any other factor, right? These are very core understandings of God, core beliefs that we have of God. Now, someone could argue, well, that's not sufficient, right? I mean, how do you go from that to the Abrahamic conception of God, right? How do you jump from, okay, that there's a necessary existent, and that makes complete sense based on this, it's completely logical, right? There has to be an initiator, right? There has to be something that starts this whole process, this whole chain of causes and effects. There has to be a prime source, right? Okay, that makes sense, but how do you prove that this now is, the the Abrahamic conception of God, right? So we're going to go through that, and we're going to go through it in steps because each one of these points they build on the previous, right? But does anybody have questions about this argument? Does it make sense, Brother Muhammad?
So like add on what you were saying, doesn't that like go off with the complexity versus simplicity concept?
Yeah. So we're going to get to that. That's the next step. Yes. But very good. I like how you're already jumping to the next point, which is excellent. So continuing with our review, right? So we said the necessary existence, right? It's independent of any other cause. It doesn't require anything else to make it materialize. It just is and always has. Oh, it always will be. It is, it was, and always will be, right? There is no type of limitation. There's no contingency for this necessary existent, right? And we call that necessary existent God, right? Now, well, we still have to make a couple other steps here. Okay, well, how do you jump to that conclusion that that necessary being is God? So the first thing that we say is, right, this necessary being, and we'll just abbreviate N, but the necessary being is independent, meaning that there's no contingency at all, right? We already defined that. The second point is that everything is dependent on the necessary existent, because the necessary existent is the thing that starts everything, right? It starts the whole chain. It starts the existence of everything else in the universe, right? All other contingent beings go back to that necessary existent. So everything is dependent ontologically, right? From an existential standpoint, everything is dependent on that necessary existence, right? So once we establish that, then we start getting into other points here, right? So we say that basically there's positive and negative attributes for this necessary existent. The first thing is that if something is completely independent of everything, right, then that within this we have, for instance, time, space, and matter, right? So this necessary existence has to be independent of all of these factors, right? So because of that, we get that he has to be completely incorporeal. He cannot be corporeal. He cannot have a body, right? Because body is a limitation of space and matter, right? So by this definition, by the fact that the necessary existent is independent of time, space, and matter, right? Independent of everything, but amongst those things being time, space, and matter, one of the correlations we get, or the conclusions we derive from this, is that he has no corporeality about him, right? The second thing is that there's no dimensionality, right? Dimensionality is, again, a limitation of space, right? So there's no dimensionality about God, right? About this necessary existence. He doesn't exist in a certain dimension. He cannot be subsumed within a dimensional space because he's outside of dimensions, right? He's completely independent of dimensions, right? Number 4 is temporality, right? So again, that follows from time. He cannot be limited into any type of time, right? Because that necessitates a dependence, right? And God is completely independent, right? And now going back to this notion, so composition, can somebody explain to me why the necessary existence cannot have any type of composition? I think Brother Muhammad already alluded to it. Can you explain further?
But can you this?
So this necessary
what's
being,
composition? Like, what do you mean?
so this necessary being cannot be made of parts. Why can he not be made of parts?
Because being made of parts would give it the characteristics of being complex and
Yeah,
when,
complex.
If it's made of
Good.
parts, then if you take away a part of it, then it's not the thing it was. So therefore, it's dependent on the part.
Yes, exactly.
So then it
Okay,
becomes
I like it.
dependent on
So that is very key, right? So when we say that the necessary being is independent, that also means that there cannot be any interdependence, right? So if there is complexity in God, right, then that necessitates that he is interdependent. His parts are dependent upon each other, right? And thus, that completely negates the idea that he's independent, right? His parts, if you can imagine a God where if you subtract, part X from him, then he ceases to be God, or he ceases to be complete, then he's not God, right? He's not truly independent because his existence is contingent upon the sum of his parts, right? Yeah.
It's interesting. I think the argument about complexity and simplicity, when people push for God to be complex, and they say, why isn't God complex? It's curious because if you look at like a laptop, if you look at a cell phone, that's a complex item. It's a complicated mechanism. The complements that you're giving this mechanism or the system are not to the device itself, but to its creator, I assume, right? The creator of that the device was actually getting the credit. It's not the
Right.
device itself. So I think there's a fallacy in thinking that complex things are better than simple things, because in complex things, the credit doesn't go to the itself. It goes to whatever made it complex, so whatever made the intricacies in it that made it so I guess complex.
Yeah, so there's a philosopher, he wrote this book, Why I'm Not a Christian, Bertrand Russell, right? So he wrote this book and he said, look, the reason why I don't believe in God is that this universe is so complex, right? So God must be even more complex. So if the universe is so complex, then the creator of it must be even more complex. So the question automatically begs itself. If the universe needs a cause, then why doesn't God need a cause? Because he must be even more complex than the universe, right? So this was his line of thinking, exactly kind of what you're saying, right? So the way to address it, the way to dismantle this type of reasoning is to say that complexity is actually a feature of weakness. It's a feature of dependency. It's a feature of contingency,
Severe
right?
dependency on
Yeah.
There's so many. The more complicated you are, the more parts you have.
Yes.
So actually, you're more and more dependent on parts and parts and parts.
Right. So this idea that, oh, well, simplicity cannot beget complexity, that's actually a fallacy. How does that follow? How can you prove that logically? That's not a logical conclusion. There's no reason why simplicity cannot beget complexity. A simple example from mathematics, right? Have you guys heard of what are they called? you know those geographic patterns or those geometric patterns that can kind of fold into each other, and they're like, what are they called? Somebody remind me.
Euclidean, non-Euclidean.
Not Euclidean. It's
Fractal.
like fractals. That's it. Yep.
Nice.
Very good. So fractals, a simple pattern, but you can keep zooming in, and it keeps staying complex, right? And actually, you can mathematically, you can actually model the equation for a fractal, right? And it's a simple equation, but it begets such complexity, right? So this idea that simplicity cannot beget complexity is complete garbage. It doesn't follow, right? So that's another reason why. But again, the complexity argument is really important because it's tied into this notion of necessity, right? If God is a necessary being, meaning he has no contingency whatsoever, then he cannot be made up of parts. Because if he's made up of parts, it automatically implies that if you subtract part X, he ceases to be complete, right? He has a contingency, his intercontingencies, right? So that's another key limitation. So already you're starting to see how we're getting closer and closer to this notion of an immaterial, simple, simple creator, right? Who has no parts, no basically divisions, right? Okay, so does that make sense to you guys? Do you have any questions about that?
I do have one.
Yes.
So when we say independent, everything is dependent on n. Some would say everything was dependent on n in the beginning, but then after that they're on their own. But that would also be, I would assume, incorrect in this paradigm, in that they're always being sustained by n.
Right.
In terms of existence, with all things involved in existence, either temporal or non-temporal existence, you'll always be sustained by n. So it's not just that n gave you the power to exist, and now you can exist independently. You're always going to be um,
Dependent.
on. And I think sometimes the way this was posited, some people may kind of go into that, or at least I went into that, where it's like, oh, he just kind of existed you, and now you are kind of your own thing. But that's not how it is.
Yeah. You're getting to a very important thing that I want to talk about because
Sorry, I didn't know.
no, that's a really important point, right? But does up to this point does it make sense logically? Do you guys have any questions, Andrew?
I think maybe you already went over this, but like, so how can like an intelligence arise out of like the most purely simple thing that there, because like somebody's brain, like the reason why they can be intelligent and conscious is because there's all these interdependent parts. Like if you lobotomize someone, they will change drastically.
Right.
So it's like how does intelligence arise out of something so purely simple?
Yeah. So intelligence. So you have to also understand what do you mean by intelligence, right?
Like
This capacity to intellect, this capacity to think, right? So God doesn't need to think, right? Because for us we have to process things, right? We even when you make a CPU, for instance, it's a processing unit. All the parts have to come together, and it needs time to sort of digest thoughts. But for God, he knows instantly, right? One of the things we talked about a couple weeks ago was that to describe God as rational is actually, in Islam, it's incorrect. God is not rational. God is knowledgeable. He's omniscient, but he's not rational, right? Because rationality is a characteristic of a being that has an intellect, right? That has for instance, and when we say intellect, we mean in the sense that he has to think and reflect and ponder. God doesn't need to ponder, right? He doesn't need to reflect. He just knows, right? So, so the way to think about it is, and we're going to get into this notion because I think it's really, really, your question is really important, but it's tied into this next discussion, which I think is really, really going to answer, maybe clarify a lot of things. Okay, so the thing that we say right about this necessary existent is that he is the cause of everything, right? He's the cause of everything in existence, right? Why? Because he was the first thing, and every other thing is contingent upon him, right? Like we said, everything is dependent on the necessary existent, right? Who we're calling God in this case. But I'm going to use the term necessary existent because God is going to, that is more obfuscation. I think it's better to use this term necessary existent. So everything is dependent on this necessary existent, right? So what's the characteristic of this necessary existent? It is the cause of everything in existence, right? So one of the things about that are very fundamental to understanding this is understanding the different types of causes, right? So when we talk about causes, right, we talk about what we call preparatory causes, right? In Arabic, this is called al-illatul mu'idda, is how we call it in Arabic, but I'm just going to stick to English terms for now. So preparatory causes, right? And then you have what we call al-illatul haqiqiyya, or real causes, right? Or maybe we can even say, I think real causes is the best translation. Okay, so what's the difference between these two? Okay, so preparatory causes are things that basically they're factors that are needed to make something actualize, but they're not required to continue to persist in order for that thing to exist, right? So for instance, like let's say a tree, right? A tree basically needs, you need to water it. You need to have a seed, right? You need to have basically soil, right? You need those factors, right? To kind of make a tree grow, right? But a tree, I mean, once a tree exists, once a tree is there, right? You can take away the soil, you can take all those things away, and the tree is still, I mean, you could still pluck out the tree from the ground, you could still have a tree, right? So, or for instance, think about it like Abdullah, for instance, right? His mother and father needed to come together in order for him to be born, right? But once that happens, I mean, even if his mother and father, God forbid, separate, you know, he still exists, right? So that's just an example. That's what we call preparatory causes, meaning certain factors need to come together for something to materialize, right? Basically, an effect is contingent upon certain causes, but only for a limited period of time, right? And once those things actualize, once that circumstance actualizes, it's no longer dependent on the causes anymore. Does that make sense to you guys? So that's what we call preparatory causes. They need to exist to prepare that thing to come into existence, to materialize. But once it materializes, they no longer are dependent. They're no longer are dependent on those causes. Does that make sense? Okay, so now what are real causes? Real causes are the exact opposite. It means that no matter what, right, you are constantly inextricably tied to that cause. If that cause ever ceases to exist, you cease to exist, right? So that's the link, right? So that's what we call a real cause, right? Preparatory causes, if they cease to exist, it doesn't make a difference, right? You can continue to persist, right? So that's the difference. So now the question we have to ask is that we said the necessary existent is the cause of everything, right? So is he a preparatory cause or is he a real cause, right? That's the big question you have to ask yourself, right? And once you understand this, then a lot of questions start to make sense. So why can he not be a preparatory cause? So this goes back to Abdullah's point, right? Abdullah, what did you say? You said that that God is not such that, okay, he breathes into you spirit, or he makes you come to existence, and then if God just, you know, suddenly stopped existing, you know, you could persist, you could continue to exist. God's constantly funneling existence into you, right? So in such a way that if God were to cease to exist, you would cease to exist, right?
Well, my point was from the point of the existence creature, in that they don't even have that power.
Yeah.
They don't even have that power to put themselves to exist.
Right.
The power to cause existence or to exist, I guess, on their own. That power isn't present in them. But you bring another point in that if the primary cause was eliminated, you know, there wouldn't be an effect.
Right. So okay, so one of the things, so how do we reconcile them? So is God a preparatory cause or a real, or is the necessary existent a preparatory cause or a real cause of all other contingent things? What do you guys think? So remember we said everything is dependent on n, right? It's not possible for n to cease to be and everything exists, right? Because we said everything is dependent on n. That's part of the definition. So he has to be a real cause, right? If the necessary existent were to cease existing for even a moment, all of his dependencies would cease to exist, right? Because everything's dependent on him, right? Does that make sense?
How do we logically prove it?
No, logically it completely follows from this argument, right? So the thing is, if if God was a preparatory cause, so one thing is argument by consequence, right? So what you do is you say, okay, well, let's imagine that God was a preparatory cause, right? So if God was a preparatory cause, that means that he was just a factor that led to the materialization of something, right? And now that thing is no longer dependent on the necessary existence, right? He's no longer dependent on it, right? His existence now is not contingent upon the necessary existence, right? So if you say that, then he's actually become now independent, right? So it's an incorrect conclusion. So he has to be constantly, basically, that dependency is part and parcel. That contingency is naturally built in to everything that is other than the necessary existent, right? So that contingency is something very fundamental. The other way to think about it is this, right? We said the necessary existent is basically always exists, always has existed, always exists, and will continue to exist, right? There's no temporality about him, right? Now, whenever you talk about causes, right, you're talking about temporality. Temporality is kind of inextricably tied to the idea of a cause, right? I mean, you can think about causality in this way, that the cause comes before the effect, right? So God is outside of those constraints, right? So everything else that we know of in this universe, right, falls under this kind of purview of time, right? And so in that sense, right, even time itself, uh, is sort of, it needs basically a cause. Even you can think about time. Time's existence requires a cause, right? So, if for instance you're going to say that God, basically, if God ceased to exist, right? God were to cease to exist, time, space, and matter would continue to exist, right? Or they're basically no limitations. Then you're basically saying that they're independent. Time, space, and matter are completely independent. But we know time, space, and matter by the laws of physics are actually all interdependent. Time cannot exist without space, which cannot exist without matter. They're all per general relativity of Einstein. They all actually are in a single continuum, right? So that time, space, and matter by definition are actually dependent on each other, right? So they cannot. There's no possibility for them to exist, right, without one another. So that they're, by definition, they have to be contingent entities. They can never become necessary, right?
Someone did then argue, I guess then, well, like, black holes and things that we don't know about space. How can we make this jump that, that time, space, and matter are always interdependent?
Oh, mathematically, it's proven. Time, space, and matter, they're all interdependent. There's a constant link between time, matter, and space. Matter cannot exist in isolation of time. Space cannot exist in isolation of matter, right? They all are on a single continuum, right? So, but this is just a principle, right, to illustrate the very many ways that we can prove this, that God is the real cause of everything in existence, right? Meaning that if God were to cease to exist, if we could even imagine that possibility, everything would cease to exist as well, right? Because it's inextricably tied to God. Yeah, Muhammad?
They said that systems are not haphazard, they're devised. Stability of universe under a system. This is scientific logic, a device.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that argument, but it requires a lot of sub-arguments. So you see some people, they say what they believe in this idea of entropy. So they say, well, universe is organized maybe within our specific solar system, but if you look at the grand scheme of things, right, the universe is completely disorganized. It's just maybe we just got lucky and there's just the right circumstances in our part of the universe where it seems like there's order. But if you look at the whole universe, there's this law of entropy that there's constant chaos, right? There's chaos everywhere throughout the universe, but just in our specific area, maybe it just seems like there is a degree of order, right? So that's sort of one of the arguments that are made, and It's an argument. That's why I think it's a strong argument. But the only problem is there's a lot of basically sub discussions you can have in it, and that's why it's not foolproof like this argument, right?
You have to have the assumption of wisdom as well
Yeah,
in design. Because assume that there's wisdom in all the design.
right,
That's an assumption that people would not accept.
right. So okay, yeah,
So going back to time, space, and matter.
Yeah.
So when you said it's interdependent, you're saying that like it's like considered like a complexity like all together.
time, space, and matter. Yeah, it's actually
Like when you gave like the God has many parts of it.
yeah.
Saying that
So
it's
time,
like a
space, and matter. This is actually an argument against materialism, right? So time, space, and matter they cannot truly be the necessary existent because they're all interdependent upon each other, right? Interdependency is completely negated from the necessary existent. The necessary existent cannot have any parts, right? Cannot be composed of elements, right? So that fact that time, space, and matter are different elements, different entities that are all interdependent proves that cannot be God, right? That cannot be the necessary existent. But okay, so because there's a little bit left that I want to explain before we run out of time here. So okay, so we said God is, or we said the necessary existent is a real cause, right? Meaning that um, he or its existence is always necessary, right? Okay, so one thing I want to just explain here. Okay, so if God is for every basically even in a single moment, if he were to stop basically existing, right, that everything would cease to exist, right? So the other question is to ask here is that what that means ontologically, right, from an existential standpoint, is that everything in the universe, every type of perfection that exists in the universe, it ontologically traces itself back to the necessary existent, right? So any type of, because his existence is always necessary and all existence basically stems from this necessary existent, that means that whatever type of ontological perfection, whatever type of existential perfection something has, it traces its origin back to the necessary existence. So that means that he or it is, right? It is the source of all perfections, right? And when we say perfections, so people can say, okay, what does this word perfection mean? It's kind of a relative word, right? It means that every type of, basically, every type of, in a sense, every type of ontological completeness, right? So when we say perfection, we mean completeness in the sense that, you know, anything that exists in this world, that exists in a limited form, of basically completeness, where it has some significance, it has some type of existence. That existence must be taken to the umpteenth level, right? To the highest basically iteration within the necessary cause, right? Within the necessary existence, right? So what do we mean by that? So three attributes that I want to outline here, right? So ever livingness, omnipotence, and omniscience, right? So what do we mean by, so we say life, right? Knowledge and power, right? And there's more attributes that we can derive. These are what we call the essential attributes, right, of the necessary existent, right? And they all come from this idea of God being the real cause of all existence, right? Or the necessary existent being the real cause of all existence, right? So life, knowledge, and power. So how do we derive these things, okay? So we say, like, look, everything in the universe is either living or dead, right? Living or dead. So if something is either living or dead. Something is either knowledgeable or ignorant, right? Something either has knowledge or does not have knowledge, right? Something either has power or is powerless, right? So remember what I said about completeness, right? There's a sense of completeness. Power is more complete than being powerless, right? Life is more complete than being dead, right? Or being lifeless, right? So every type of ontological perfection you can think of, right? Life, knowledge, power. These are three ontological perfections. They have to reach their basically their perfect, most infinite iteration in God, right? In the necessary existent. Otherwise, right? We said that any type of life in existence, any type of knowledge in existence, any type of power in existence, it couldn't come from anywhere else, right? It couldn't have come from anywhere else because God is the real cause. He's the source of everything, right? This necessary existent is the source of everything. Everything is dependent on the necessary existent. So by definition, the necessary existent has to be the source of any type of life, knowledge, and power that exists in the creation, that exists in the contingent existences, right? So what that means, so life, right? You can say, okay, well, life means the capacity to grow, right? You can define life like that. You can say knowledge is the capacity to be able to process and think and be able to derive information. You can say power is this ability to desire. I desire for something to happen, and then I, basically want something. I really want something to occur, and so you can basically humanize these three elements, right? Life being a capacity to grow, knowledge, a capacity to intellect, to basically think about something and derive a conclusion. Power, a desire, an inclination that someone has that he tries to actualize, right? So you could try to humanize each one of these attributes, but what we say is no. That's not the correct understanding of this. The correct way to do it is to strip it of all of its human attributes, because humanness is actually a trait of basically mortality, right? Mortality is a trait of a finite being, right? But any type of life, knowledge, and power that exists in us within the scope of mortality, within the scope of humanity, must have a source, must have come from somewhere where it has reached its ultimate perfection, right? Because remember, the necessary existence is completely independent of everything. So that means these attributes that exist within us have to have a source within the necessary existent where it reaches its pinnacle, right? Where it's perfect, it's complete. So what do we say life is? Life is not the capacity to grow, but basically the capacity to exist, or the capacity to be alive, right? This capacity of what we call ever livingness, right? So living, this idea of living being sentient, right? This sentience has to have, if we are sentient, right? If we have the capacity to be alive, to be awake, to be cognizant, right? To be conscious. This consciousness has to have a source of infinite consciousness, right? And this consciousness is not so you have to strip it from that human element, right? There's no humanity, there's no mortality associated with this. So growth is not a feature of God, because God is infinite, he's perfect, right? There's no capacity for growth, right? Because if something is dependent, that's when the element of growth enters the equation. Something that's independent, that's unlimited, has no capacity for growth. It is sort of the ultimate consciousness, right? So that's how we define ever livingness, right? So knowledge, right? So we said, okay, well, the capacity to think, rationalize, try to intellect, right? We say, well, in this sense, right, that human beings, they have to think and derive and put pieces together, right? This is the limitation of a mortal being, right? But what is the thing that the mortal being is trying to gather? He's trying to gather information, right? So information, knowledge, the source of that knowledge, right? This basically all this knowledge that we have has to have hit its ultimate pinnacle form in God, right? So that's why God is the ultimate source of knowledge. He is the most knowledge. He is the ultimate knowledge, right? Some people even say God is the ultimate knowledge, right? But we say the all-knowing, the omniscience, right? Is where that term comes from. So omniscience. And then power, right? Whatever power that a human being has to actualize. So you might say, okay, well, this is in the sense of desire, that I want to do something, right? But we say no. Power in this sense means to do something, to actually do something, not necessarily the desire element. Strip it of its human element. That desire, that moment that I want to do something, and then you start thinking about it, and then you decide to do it, and then you do it, right? Strip all of that. It's that those are all human elements, right? That thinking, that's a feature of a complex being, right?
Potential ability. That's all.
Right? Yeah, those are all potentialities. But God is al-fa'al, meaning that he just does, right? So there's no moment of where God has to think, reflect, ponder, right? There's none of that. But God is the ultimate doer, right? If human beings have the capacity to do, they have that free will, that capacity to actualize their volition, right? Then God is the ultimate actualizer of his volition, right? So this is how we get the attribute of omnipotence, right? So you see how we're already getting very close to an Abrahamic conception of God if you just understand this argument properly. And you derive, each one of these things actually derives, each one of these building blocks derives from the next one. And so already we established some of the divine attributes of God, which are what we call essential attributes, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, and ever-livingness, right? So there's some other details here, but I think this is sort of the summary of what I wanted to discuss today, inshallah.
So to add on to the three features that all of them cover, for a human, those are only attainable by what the human is known to. Like a person can't have power over something that like is impossible to bring into existence, or a person doesn't have the knowledge of like, for example, a black hole. What's in a black hole?
Right.
So, and then for God, you're saying is those three concepts, but limitless.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess what you're saying is, like, for instance, ignorance, right? So someone could say, well, ignorance, they could posit this. They could say, well, ignorance is an attribute of us, of creations, right? So in God, ignorance must reach the pinnacle. What would you respond to that? What would be your response to that, Jibril?
It's a negative attribute. Ignorance is not like something you have, it's the absence of knowledge.
Yes. Yeah, the absence of knowledge, right? So basically, like I said, remember this idea of perfection is idea of completeness, right? So ignorance is actually the absence of knowledge, right? So there's no perfection there, right? Perfection is the idea of completeness, this concept of knowledge, that someone has knowledge, information, right? That information has to have basically just the capacity that we have to be able to have knowledge, right? It has that existence that of knowledge has to have an umpteenth form. It has to have a pinnacle form, right? A complete form, and that complete form must exist in the necessary existent, right? Because he is the source of everything in our basically that all the contingent beings that come to persist under him, right? Does that make sense? It's a little bit abstract, but I hope it's starting to make sense. So this is really important. And if you guys have questions, also you can read the chapter, because if you read the chapter, I think it'll really help solidify some of these concepts. But this is super, super essential, because if you understand these things, a lot of these concepts of why God must be ever living, why he must be omnipotent, why he must be omniscient, it all starts to come together.
One more question. Going back to the difference between preparatory cause and a real cause. Why could God not be a preparatory?
Yeah, so we said a preparatory cause means that something basically made something actualized, right? Made something actualized, and then that thing becomes independent of the thing which actualized it, right? So, for instance, a necessary existent made something happen, right? It actualized it, and then basically it completely divorced itself, right? So basically, if we were to switch the necessary existent, remember we gave the idea of, I think we gave this analogy of light switches. Do you guys remember the analogy of light switches? I think this is a good way to think about it. So remember what we said about the necessary existent? It's always in the on position, right? I remember we said with contingent beings, they could be in the on position or the off position. Remember we said this? And by default, they're in the off position, right? And then the impossibilities, they're always in the off, right? They can't ever be on, right? So, okay. So remember, we said by default, all contingent beings are in the off position, right? The necessary being is by default always in the on position, right? So the thing is, let's say we said, okay, the necessary being, something was in the off position, right? A contingent being was in the off position, and he snapped it into the on position, right? And then let's say he ceases to exist, right? Then this next thing has to basically become locked in the on position, right? Because now this thing is going to become the subsister, the thing that causes the rest of the circuit to stay on, right?
Okay. I remember you gave like a, I believe the generator.
Yes, the generator example was another way to think about it.
And then somebody had a comment or a counter to what brother said, saying that ignorance is a lack of knowledge. They said that ignorance is different from illiteracy. Lack of knowledge is illiteracy. Ignorance is denying after knowledge or ignoring.
Okay. Well,
So I think they were adding
I think the gist of what the argument is though is that whatever if you say whatever is the opposite of knowledge, right? Knowledge, if you're going to say the opposite of knowledge is illiteracy or ignorance, whatever you want to call it, right? But somebody could say, okay, well then God is the ultimate illiterate, right? A'udhu billah, right? Somebody could say God is the ultimate ignorant, right? Because they take ignorance as a type of perfection and then they try to amplify it into God, right? But what we say is no, because that's actually an existential imperfection. That's an existential lack of knowledge. It's an existential lack, right? It's ontological nothingness. So that's why you cannot say that that reaches its pinnacle into God, right?
How is it to think that nothing as a concept exists? Nothing
Right.
as a concept is non-existent.
Yeah.
Because it becomes
But any type of perfection you can imagine, right? You have to strip it, of course, of its subjective elements, of its human mortal elements, and it reaches its umpteenth perfection in God, right? So that's a way to think about this notion. And these are again the essential attributes, the three key essential attributes within classic Islamic philosophy. So ever-livingness, omnipotence, omniscience, that you want to remember about God. And then from this, we start to get into, now we have a lot of other attributes, right, of God. Within Islam, we have 99 attributes, right? So how do you, these attributes we're going to get into next time, inshallah, I think perhaps in a couple weeks, right, Brother Abdullah?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So, but those attributes are what we call attributes of action, right? So attributes of action refer to the actions, basically that God has sort of a relationship, or there's a relation between God and his creation. And those attributes describe what that relationship is. So for instance, being a creator, al-Khaliq, right? That's not an essential attribute of God, right? Because that requires something to be created. In order to call God creator, there has to be something that was created. So it describes a relationship between God and creation. So al-Khaliq, al-Khaliqiyya, or that creatorship, being a creator, requires that a creation exists, right? Being a raziq, right, the sustainer, requires that a creation exists,
God does not
right?
require creation for something.
Yeah. So basically, those are attributes of action, right? That God has done something, and that action basically also Allah's rahmah, right? Being Rahman, Rahim. These are attributes towards the creation. Being merciful requires an object of mercy, right? So that's what we call an attribute of action, right? So this is sort of another discussion that we'll have next time, inshallah.
My question then is God dependent on God as merciful, dependent on the creation to exist?
No, no, no.
We'll go into that.
Because we give the titles like Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, but then he's being that to us, to his creation. So if the creation doesn't exist, then what's the
If the creation does not exist,
if they're like if he like how brother was saying, is God dependent on himself?
Yeah, so no, these are the key attributes of God, right? But actually, all the attributes of action, we can actually derive them from these three, right? So why is God merciful? Because if you have full knowledge and you have full power, there's no reason why you would be oppressive, right? There's no reason. First off, what's the opposite of mercy? You could say maybe an extent you could say wrath, right? But the actual opposite of mercy being compassionate, being kind, would be like being mean or being cruel, right? Cruelness implies uh, like sort of like like treating somebody unfairly, treating somebody in a way that they don't deserve, right? Whereas mercy is a quality of some treating someone, with compassion, with the basically with care and uh, sort of yeah, sort of that providence, right? So that that's an attribute of someone who has the ultimate power, the ultimate authority, ultimate knowledge, right? Because every type of cruelness or injustice, it stems from deficiency, right? If someone is perfect, they won't be cruel, they won't be rude, they won't be harsh, right? So,
I
yes.
guess what I'm saying is, if there is no creation, then is God not considered a Rahman? Because
That would be the question that would be asked.
yeah, but there's no creation to be merciful.
Yeah, but Rahman is a trait. It's a trait of mercy, right? Mercy requires an object. So no, Rahman is also it's an attribute of action, right? It's an attribute of action. Uh, it's not an essential attribute because it requires a cause. It requires a source. It requires an object of mercy, right? So so basically, God being the creator, he has to have a creation to which to be merciful. Otherwise, to describe God in his own essence as being merciful doesn't make sense, because who is he going to be merciful to, right?
I think he was saying we derive from the essential, we derive from
Yeah,
the powerful.
we can derive all the attributes of action from the essential ones, right? So, but I just think this is super important. And if you just look very briefly at Nahj al-Balagha, you guys have heard of Nahj al-Balagha, all of you, I'm sure, right? Brother Jibril, you've heard of Nahj al-Balagha?
Collections of sermons and letters of Imam Ali
So,
alayhi salam.
just very briefly, I just want to read just the first sermon. It'll take like just 5 minutes or something, but uh, um, so I just want you guys to see how Imam Ali describes God, and you'll see how many of these things we're saying, they're crystallized in exactly what Imam Ali is saying, right? So, because when you understand God the correct way, this is the idea of what we call tawheed, right? The idea of pure monotheism in Islam, right? But when you understand God, and this is somebody, again, we're saying 1400 years ago, right? Somebody at the time of in the middle of Arabia, right? This is how he's describing God, right? So he says, praise is due to God, whose worth cannot be described by speakers, whose bounties cannot be counted by calculators, and whose claim to obedience cannot be satisfied by those who attempt to do so. He for whose description no limit has been laid down, no time is ordained, and no duration is fixed, right? Again, independent of time, independent of space, right? Already we're getting this sense from what he's merely saying here, right? He brought forth creation through his omnipotence, dispersed winds through his compassion, and made firm the shaking earth with rocks. The foremost in religion is the acknowledgement of him. The perfection of acknowledging him is to testify him. The perfection of testifying him is to believe in his oneness. The perfection of believing in his oneness is to regard him as pure. The perfection of his purity is to deny him attributes. Attributes in the sense of every attribute basically is a proof that it is different from that to which it is attributed, right? So meaning that every time we give an attribute to God, we say that God is like this, God is like that. We're actually limiting God, right? It's actually imposing a limitation on God. Remember we said that God is simple, there's no complexity about him, right? So when we say, for instance, 99 names of God, right? 99 names of God, are you not describing that there's all these partitions in God? That God's merciful, he is compassionate, he is this, he is that, he is the sustainer, he is the creator, he's all of these things. Like, are you not compartmentalizing God? We say no because these attributes don't do justice to God, right? God is all of these things simultaneously, but it's not possible for a human being to understand. So that's why we use these different labels, these different attributes. But God is all of these things simultaneously in simplicity. There's no complexity, right? He's all these perfections at once, right? So I think this is very interesting. So just very quickly, he says, he is a being, but not through the phenomenon of coming into being. He exists, but not from non-existence. He is with everything, but not in physical nearness. He is different from everything, but not in physical separation. He acts, but without connotation of movements and instruments. He sees, even when there is none to be looked at from among his creation. He is only one, such that there is none with whom he may keep company or whom he may miss in his absence. Right? So these just this sort of, and people have done like they've written whole books on just this sermon, because it's so deep, like it's so profound. Each line is so profound, right? He is a being, but not through the phenomenon of coming into being. Remember, we said there's no dependence on time. He always was, he always is, and he always will be. There's no dependence to time there, right? He exists, but not from non-existence. It wasn't like he didn't exist and then he came into existence, right? He's always in the on position. He's always necessary, right? So all of these things I'm describing to you kind of from a philosophical standpoint, you see their substantiations. You see how they're actually articulated by someone 1400 years ago in a very pristine form, right? So that shows you the depth of kind of Imam Ali alayhi salam, you know, as as an individual who had truly understood these concepts, right? And I think that it should give us a lot of pride that we have this type of, leader, this type of paragon to be, our basically role model as someone we should aspire to have that type of understanding of God as well in our lives, inshallah.
Who we learn from, basically, who attributes all these things, these source of knowledge to.
Yes, exactly. Okay, inshallah. So I took much of your time. Inshallah. Hopefully it was useful. Inshallah.
Thank you.
Of course, inshallah.
Thank you so much.